quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in, let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. Tonight, we will follow the alleged timeline surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and the private Caribbean island, often cited in reporting and court filings as a setting for influence, coercion, and abuse. We will move carefully through what has been publicly alleged, what was stated in sworn testimony, what appears in charging documents, and what has been reported by journalists over decades. Along the way, we will mark what is confirmed by convictions and rulings, what is still disputed, and what remains unanswered after his death in custody. This is not a story of certainty in every detail. It is a story about patterns, recruitment, access, power, and the ways institutions can fail people until records finally surface and force action. This is Epstein, Dark Secrets of the Island. Before there was an island in the public imagination, there was a man who, according to multiple biographies and profiles, learned how to read a room the way some people read weather. Jeffrey Epstein, born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, is often described as arriving into adulthood with an unusual confidence and a taste for proximity to money. Much of what is known about his early years comes from reporting, from people who said they knew him, and from the outlines of his employment history. In the mid-1970s, Epstein worked as a teacher at the Dalton School in Manhattan, a private institution with wealthy families. That employment ended after a short period, and the reasons have been described in different ways depending on the source. The larger point in the public record is that this was an early intersection between Epstein and elite social circles. If you listen closely to how Epstein is described in early accounts, there is a recurring theme. He understood status as a language, and he learned how to speak it. Some people learn to speak it through inheritance. Others learn it through proximity, by watching and imitating. Reporting has described Epstein as someone who studied the mannerisms of the wealthy and the powerful, and who learned quickly how to mirror what they wanted to see. Even the Dalton chapter, brief as it was, is often treated by journalists as an origin point. A school like Dalton is not simply a workplace. It is a corridor. In a corridor, names pass from one conversation to the next, and introductions happen in the casual space between classrooms and donors' events. What can be established with certainty is limited, but it is reasonable, based on the public record, to say that Epstein's early career put him within view of a kind of New York that runs on networks rather than job titles. From there, Epstein moved into finance, including work at Bear Stearns. Accounts vary on how he rose, how he cultivated clients, and what he actually did day to day. But the pattern that appears again and again in reporting is consistent. He presented himself as a financial expert, a problem solver, a man with doors open to him that might have been closed to others. Whether that image was earned, exaggerated, or carefully constructed is still debated in public discourse. The finance world can be a perfect habitat for someone with Epstein's later reputation for ambiguity. Finance rewards confidence. It rewards discretion. It rewards the ability to speak in generalities that sound precise. And it can also reward a kind of theatre, the appearance of expertise, the suggestion of private opportunities, the implication that the real story is happening elsewhere, just beyond the edge of ordinary sight. By the time Epstein was described, in some reporting, as operating his own financial advisory business, questions about his wealth were already part of the myth. The phrase mysterious fortune appears in many profiles. Journalists have noted that his client list was not publicly clear, that the scale of his known operations appeared small compared to his lifestyle, and that he claimed at times to manage money for billionaires. The public record includes assertions and denials that do not fully resolve into a single narrative. In a conventional biography, that would be a problem. In this story, it becomes part of the mechanism. Mystery in the right rooms reads as exclusivity. By the 1980s and 1990s, Epstein was known in certain circles as a figure who could arrange introductions, broker favors, and create the feeling of invitation. He reportedly acquired properties and maintained residences that served as stages for social mixing. New York, Florida, New Mexico, and later the US Virgin Islands. In this period, he also developed a network of assistants, employees, and associates, some of whom would later be named in civil suits or described in testimony. Those residences were not just personal comforts. In many accounts, they functioned like sets. They were environments where the host controlled the lighting, the tempo, the boundaries. A guest arrives and is greeted by staff. The scale itself communicates power. And if the person at the center behaves as if rules are flexible, guests can find themselves adjusting unconsciously to the host's frame. That is how social gravity works. It is important to say clearly, a network is not the same thing as a conspiracy. People orbit powerful individuals for many reasons, and some may know little about what happens beyond the public face of a household. But in the Epstein story, court filings and witness accounts would later argue that the structure around him was not incidental. According to a number of alleged victims and to prosecutors in later cases, it functioned as a system that made exploitation easier. Recruitment paths, scheduling, transport, money, and a constant signal that certain rules did not apply. In the materials that have become public over time, there are descriptions of routine: a number, a call, a calendar, a driver, a payment. Routine matters because it contradicts the comforting myth that harm is always chaotic. Many survivors of abuse describe something different: harm that is organized, repeated, and embedded in daily life. When a pattern is normalized as routine, it becomes harder to recognize as emergency. The public record also includes Epstein's association with the financier Leslie Wexner, the head of the retail company that owned brands like Victoria's Secret. Epstein at one point was described as managing aspects of Wexner's finances, and in reporting this relationship is often treated as pivotal because it appeared to legitimize Epstein within elite spaces. Wexner has publicly stated that he severed ties and later expressed regret. The details of what Epstein did, what he had access to, and how that access was granted have been discussed in journalistic investigations and in legal disputes. But what matters for this narrative is the way this relationship shaped the aura around Epstein. Money, respectability, and the assumption that he was vetted. That aura is central to understanding how allegations can be delayed. There is a kind of social shortcut that operates in elite spaces. If someone is close to a known figure, many people assume the relationship itself is evidence of safety. It is a mistaken form of vetting by proximity. A person becomes someone because other someones treat them as someone. And then, quietly, the circle widens. In a story like this, there is always a second timeline running under the first. The first timeline is visible: parties, philanthropy, associations with academics and celebrities. the aesthetics of prestige. The second timeline is alleged: private encounters, recruitment, harm, and secrecy. The second timeline, for many years, existed as rumor and whisper, or as stories that did not easily attach to official action. It is not rare in cases involving wealth and influence for the first timeline to dominate. The first timeline leaves receipts, photographs, invitations, donations, and an easy narrative of success. The second timeline often leaves only the accounts of people with less power. One reason the second timeline is so vulnerable is that it often begins with something that can be explained away. A teenager is paid for a massage. A young woman is told she will be introduced to someone important. The word model is used, or assistant, or tutor. According to allegations in multiple accounts, the ambiguity is not accidental. It allows the person in control to test reactions and to shift the story if challenged. According to multiple court filings and reports, Epstein cultivated environments where young women and girls were brought into his orbit, sometimes through other young women, sometimes through job offers or vague promises of opportunity. In sworn statements and interviews, some alleged victims described being approached at a mall, at a school, or through social connections, and then being drawn into increasingly coercive situations. The details vary by person, and not every account is identical, but the pattern described is broadly similar. An initial offer, an introduction to a home, a request framed as a massage, and a gradual escalation. In some allegations, the escalation is described not as a sudden leap, but as a slow adjustment. The first boundary crossed becomes a reference point. Each new request is framed as only slightly more than what came before. This is one reason grooming is so hard to explain from the outside. People who have not experienced it may ask, why didn't they leave? They imagine a single obvious moment when the danger becomes clear. Survivors often describe something more subtle: confusion, fear, and the sense that the situation is already underway before it is fully named. When we say alleged, we do not mean distant. We mean that the legal system requires careful language, and that the story we are telling is built from what can be supported by records, police reports, depositions, indictments, plea agreements, and published investigations. In several instances, Epstein was accused in civil suits and later charged criminally. In 2008, he pleaded guilty in Florida State Court to charges that included solicitation of prostitution and solicitation of prostitution of someone under the age of 18. That is not rumor. It is a matter of record. The contested parts of the story are the full scope, the full list of participants, and the extent of knowledge among those around him. That 2008 conviction is often mentioned as a pivot point, but it is also, paradoxically, a fog. For some people, the conviction was treated as a contained scandal, a problem that had been handled. For others, it was an alarm that never stopped ringing. For Epstein, according to later reporting, it did not end his ability to host, travel, and present himself as a figure of wealth. The social consequences did not match the legal label. That mismatch is one of the reasons this case continues to haunt public trust. The island, which would later become an emblem in the public imagination, entered the story in part because it created physical distance and a private geography. In stories of exploitation, geography can be a tool. Remove witnesses, create dependency, isolate a person from their support. The Epstein case would repeatedly return to spaces that were designed to feel separate from ordinary oversight. Private jets, gated estates, and yes, an island. But before we step onto that island, we need to understand the psychology of the room. Epstein, in the accounts of people who encountered him, often presented as calm, attentive, flattering, and strangely unaccountable. People might ask where his money came from. They might be unsure. And then the conversation would drift, because the party was still going, and the invitation still stood. In powerful circles, ambiguity can be mistaken for mystery, and mystery can be mistaken for sophistication. There is a reason the phrase, "everyone knew him," appears so often in the aftermath. It is not that everyone knew him intimately. It is that his name functioned like a credential. It would show up in a donor list, on a guest list, in a conversation about funding, in an invitation to a dinner. The repetition itself did the work. This is one of the central tensions in the record. Many people describe Epstein as a man everyone seemed to know, yet few could explain. He appeared at conferences, funded research, hosted dinners with scientists and public figures. These social rituals create a kind of social proof. When respected people are present, others infer safety. When a name is repeated often enough, it begins to feel official. It is also where we have to be disciplined about what we claim. Social proximity does not equal criminal conduct. Some people who encountered Epstein may have experienced him as a donor, a host, or a curious patron of science, and nothing more. Others have said later that he made them uncomfortable, that he asked inappropriate questions, or that he seemed to collect people the way some collect objects. The public record includes a range of impressions. Documentary work does not flatten that range into a single judgment. It notes the pattern. A man who could occupy multiple roles and who seemed to understand how to perform each one. In later years, after renewed scrutiny, some institutions would examine whether donations from Epstein should be returned, whether relationships should be disclosed, whether reputational risk had been ignored. But those conversations came after harm had already been alleged by many people, and after the system, according to critics, had already failed. Tonight, we are not building a legend. We are reading a file. We are tracing the way a man learned the room, and how the room, at times, chose not to look too closely. We should also notice how time works in cases like this. The alleged abuse spans years, and the public response arrives in waves. A local investigation happens. A plea deal happens. Years pass. Survivors age, move, try to build lives. Then a journalist finds the old documents. A new case emerges. The story becomes national. The past returns. That is why an archive matters. An archive does not care about reputations. It does not care about the comfort of institutions. It holds what was written down, and it waits. And in cases like this, waiting is not neutral. Time can erase evidence. It can blur memory. It can make survivors doubt themselves. It can also give power to the accused, who can count on fatigue and distraction. When records finally surface, they often do not arrive with a clean ending. They arrive late, partial, and heavy. But even late records can change what society is willing to admit. The island most frequently mentioned in public reporting connected to Epstein is Little St. James, a privately owned island in the US Virgin Islands. In articles, documentaries, and court filings, it is often described as a place where Epstein could control access, set rules, and create a world that felt sealed from routine oversight. Images of the island, including aerial photographs and later footage of investigators, helped cement it as a symbol. But to understand what an island means in a case like this, it helps to think in terms of logistics. A private island is not just a location, it is a system. There are boats, pilots, staff, schedules, communications. There are points of entry and exit. There are places where someone can be visible and places where someone can disappear. According to accounts in the public record, Epstein maintained resources that allowed him to move people between his properties. That movement, alleged victims have said, was part of how control was exercised. When journalists describe Little St. James, they often note its size, its distance from larger population centres, and the way it sits inside a US territory, with its own government and its own law enforcement capacity. Jurisdiction matters. An island is not outside the law, but it can be outside the ordinary rhythm of oversight, especially if access is controlled and activity is framed as private hospitality. That gap between what is illegal and what is enforced is where wealth can operate. In addition to the island itself, there is a second layer, the mythology built around the island. In the years after Epstein's death, photographs of a distinctive structure on the property circulated widely, accompanied by speculation. Some of the speculation is unsupported and sensational. The responsible approach is to separate the symbol from the evidence. The island can be a useful focus, but it can also become a screen onto which people project fantasies that distract from documented allegations. In civil lawsuits, some women alleged that they were flown to the Virgin Islands or taken to Epstein's properties under false pretenses or without fully understanding the context they were entering. Other accounts describe women being recruited to bring additional girls, often with promises of payment. Again, the details differ in each filing, and not every person describes the island as central, but the island appears repeatedly as a stage where certain allegations are concentrated. Part of why the island appears in so many narratives is that it changes the balance of power. A person can leave a mansion in Palm Beach and still be in a city with neighbors, traffic, police, and familiar landmarks. On an island, movement is a negotiation. You need a boat. You need a plane. You need permission or assistance, or the courage to demand it. And in many alleged accounts, survivors describe environments where demanding anything felt dangerous. It is also important to state what is known and what is not. The public does not have a complete record of every visit, every guest, every staff member, every activity. There are flight logs from Epstein's private aircraft that have been discussed and in some cases made public through litigation. Those logs show names, dates, and routes. They do not, by themselves, prove wrongdoing by any passenger. Many people who have been mentioned in media reports deny any knowledge of abuse, and some have said they never went to the island at all. In this story, proximity is a data point, not a verdict. The same is true of staff. A property like that requires maintenance, caretakers, security, gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, boat operators. In any wealthy household, staff can be both present and invisible. They can see a lot, but they can also be trained, implicitly, not to ask questions. Some former employees have spoken to journalists over the years. Some have been referenced in lawsuits. The full picture is not publicly complete, and it would be irresponsible to assume that every employee knew what was alleged to occur. Still, the system itself invites questions. The more complex the logistics, the more points where someone could notice something inconsistent with ordinary hospitality. A person being brought in without luggage, a teenager being dropped off and picked up repeatedly, a schedule that revolves around massages, payments made in cash. These are the kinds of details that appear in various forms in public accounts. Each one alone can be explained away. Together, they can form a pattern. The island, in the public imagination, became tied to an idea that secrecy is easier when you can choose your horizon. But secrecy is not only about distance, it is about social permission. A private island can be watched if someone with authority insists on watching. What made Epstein's world work, according to critics, was not only that it was private, it was that it was treated as untouchable. An untouchable is not a magical status. It's built out of small decisions. A customs agent waves a person through because the name is familiar. A local official assumes someone else has done the checking. A staff member decides not to record a detail because they do not want to be noticed. A neighbor sees unusual traffic and decides it is not their business. Each decision can feel minor. In aggregate, it forms a shield. It also intersects with the reality of the US Virgin Islands as both a US territory and a place where wealthy outsiders can own property and employ local labor. When harm is alleged in such places, accountability can feel distant. People may not know which agency has authority or whether a complaint will be taken seriously. That confusion alone can deter reporting. And there is another layer, the way an island can function as a social filter. Not everyone is invited. Not everyone can afford the travel. Not everyone can arrive unannounced. That means the people present are, by design, selected. Selection can create a false sense of safety. If you are invited, you may assume that invitation implies vetting. If you are surrounded by adults who act comfortable, you may assume comfort is proof. So what was the invitation? In many alleged accounts, the invitation begins with something small. A young woman is offered money to give a massage. The offer is framed as simple, maybe strange, but not necessarily dangerous. There are details that appear across statements. The house is large. The staff is present but distant. The atmosphere is both casual and controlled. The request seems to test boundaries. If the person hesitates, there may be reassurance. If the person complies, the request may escalate. In other accounts, the invitation begins in the language of opportunity. A young person is told they could meet influential people. They could be helped with school. They could travel. The offer is not framed as coercion. It is framed as selection. That framing can be powerful, especially for someone who has been taught that success comes from being noticed by the right people. The invitation also appears in Epstein's social life. Dinners with intellectuals, parties, philanthropy. Those invitations were, in a different way, boundary tests too. They asked, will you accept the aura of wealth as proof of legitimacy? Will you ignore the discomfort in exchange for access? Will you assume that someone else has checked the details? According to some reporting and later testimony, Epstein also used a particular kind of language about young women. He was allegedly focused on youth, on a certain look, on the sense of being surrounded by attention. In some public accounts, he positioned himself as a benefactor, someone who could pay for schooling, provide opportunities, arrange travel. Such narratives can create gratitude, obligation, and confusion, especially for people with less power. The island, then, can be understood as the endpoint of a process. First, normalize the strange. Second, build dependency. Third, isolate. Fourth, make the person feel complicit. Fifth, make the person feel there is no one who will believe them. Documentary style requires us to notice how these steps can be described without sensationalism. The island is not a fantasy set. It is a place with a dock and a driveway. It has rooms and locks and linens and receipts. It is, in a sense, just a property. And that is precisely what makes it chilling. Harm, in many cases, is not hidden in a cave. It is hidden in ordinary architecture behind extraordinary wealth. In the available court filings, there are also descriptions of surveillance and documentation. Some allegations suggest that Epstein kept photographs or recordings. The extent and purpose of any such materials has been the subject of speculation, investigative reporting, and law enforcement work, but much remains unknown publicly. What is known is that during searches of Epstein's properties, law enforcement documented large quantities of photographs and digital media. In 2019, federal prosecutors described discovering hundreds of sexually suggestive photographs of underage girls, as alleged in court documents. The legal process ended with Epstein's death in custody, leaving many questions unresolved. Even without a complete public record, the island served a narrative function. It concentrated the story into a single place people could picture. That can be helpful, but it can also mislead. Abuse, as alleged in this case, was not contained to an island. It was alleged in Palm Beach, in Manhattan, in other residences, in transit, and in the spaces between. Still, the island matters. It matters because it shows what resources can purchase: privacy, control, and a sense of sovereignty. It matters because it raises hard questions about oversight in jurisdictions that rely on tourism and wealthy property owners. It matters because it illustrates the practical side of influence. Who gets access to remote places? Who gets to move people across borders? Who gets to decide what is seen? It also matters because, for some alleged victims, it represents a memory of being removed from their ordinary life and placed into a world where the rules were written by one person. In multiple public accounts of trafficking and exploitation, the pattern of removal is familiar. Take a person away from their supports, change the environment, alter the cues that help them judge what is normal. An island is an extreme version of that removal. To step onto the island in this story is to step into the idea of a private kingdom. In that kingdom, according to allegations, a wealthy man was the center, and everyone else was arranged around him. Staff, guests, young women, pilots, assistants. When a system is arranged like that, accountability becomes a matter of whether anyone with power chooses to interrupt. The island also forces us to think about infrastructure as complicity. Boats need fuel, planes need maintenance, properties need permits and contractors, staff need paychecks. In a routine world, these are neutral facts. In a world where harm is alleged, they become uncomfortable questions. Who kept the lights on, and what did they understand about what the lights were illuminating? In this chapter, we do not claim to know every detail of what happened on Little St. James. We are not in possession of every record. We can only describe what is alleged in lawsuits, what is described in reporting, and what law enforcement indicated in public documents. And within those limits, the island appears less as a mythic lair and more as a practical tool. There is a quiet, unsettling truth in that. Tools are ordinary. They are not supernatural. They are built. They are maintained. They require cooperation. And if a tool is used for harm, the question becomes, how many people handled it without asking what it was for? If the island is the stage, the network is the scaffolding. And the Epstein story, as it has unfolded in the public record, is not only about one man. It is about a set of relationships that appear to have created opportunity, cover, and continuity. In court filings and in journalism, the name Ghislaine Maxwell appears as a key figure. Maxwell, the daughter of British media owner Robert Maxwell, was described by prosecutors in later cases as an associate who helped Epstein recruit, groom, and abuse minors. Maxwell has denied wrongdoing, but in 2021 she was convicted in federal court of multiple counts related to sex trafficking and other crimes connected to Epstein. That conviction is a matter of record, and it is one of the clearest legal statements about the alleged system, that it included recruitment and facilitation by more than one person. The Maxwell conviction also illustrates a detail that can get lost in the noise. For all the rumors that swirl around high-profile cases, the courtroom record is built on a narrower set of proofs. In the Maxwell trial, jurors heard from witnesses and saw evidence that prosecutors argued showed a pattern of recruitment and grooming. The defense challenged credibility and memory, as is common in such cases. The conviction does not answer every question the public asks, but it does anchor the story in a legal finding that at least one associate was criminally responsible for facilitating abuse. But networks do not operate only through named co-defendants. Networks include employees and enablers, some witting, some not. There were household staff, drivers, pilots, assistants. There were also professional services, lawyers, accountants, public relations. Not all of these roles imply knowledge of criminal conduct. Wealthy households often have teams. Yet in the allegations, the presence of staff sometimes served to normalize the environment, to make a young person feel they were in an official place, not a trap. We should pause on the difference between enable and facilitate. A person can enable harm through inaction, through denial, through silence. A person can facilitate harm by taking direct steps, arranging travel, scheduling meetings, recruiting. The public record contains allegations of both kinds of roles. It also contains denials and disputes. The documentary responsibility is to hold that complexity without turning it into fog. Some of the most consistent descriptions in alleged victim accounts involve an informal recruiting ladder. A young woman is paid. She is then encouraged or pressured to bring others. The money becomes a tool. In some accounts, the sums were small compared to Epstein's wealth, but large compared to the finances of teenagers and young adults. This differential matters. It is not simply payment. It is leverage. That recruiting ladder is a pattern that appears in many trafficking cases. The person with the least power is used to reduce risk for the person with the most power. If a teenager brings another teenager, the approach looks like peer-to-peer, not predator to target. It is a way of laundering intent through social trust, and it can create layered trauma because some survivors later carry guilt about having participated in recruitment under pressure. When people ask how such a system can operate for years, the answer is usually boring and painful. It operates because each participant sees only a slice, because each person has an incentive to keep their job, because victims fear consequences, because institutions respond slowly, and because the powerful can frame accusations as misunderstandings or as attacks. There is also a structural reason. Cases like this can be difficult to prosecute when victims are minors, when evidence is largely testimonial, and when the accused can hire aggressive legal defense. That does not excuse failure. It explains why hesitation can multiply. And when hesitation multiplies around wealth, it can become a system. There is also the public network, the social roster. Epstein was photographed with politicians, scientists, celebrities, members of royalty, and business leaders. Some of these people have since said they regret associating with him, or that they were unaware of any criminal conduct. Some have faced civil allegations or public scrutiny. It is crucial to avoid collapsing all association into guilt. But it is equally important to ask what social proximity does. In an elite environment, being seen with the right people is a kind of currency. It produces trust by association. It can make accusations seem implausible to outsiders. It can make potential whistleblowers feel isolated. If everyone important seems comfortable, then speaking up feels like shouting into a storm. It also affects media framing. A wealthy man hosting famous guests is a story that fits into a familiar genre. Eccentric billionaire. A wealthy man allegedly abusing minors is a different genre, one that demands conflict and accountability. For years, the first genre dominated. It is not simply a matter of individual journalists choosing the wrong story. It is also a matter of access. Elite stories are easier to report when elite sources talk. Victims' stories require trust, time, and the willingness to upset powerful people. The network also includes media narratives. For years, Epstein was treated in some outlets as an odd billionaire, a financier with a mysterious fortune, a man hosting salons of intellectuals. That framing matters because it sets the default assumption, curiosity rather than suspicion. Meanwhile, there were local rumors and reports in places like Palm Beach. In some communities, staff and residents whispered about young girls going in and out of a mansion. But whispers are not charges. And without charges, powerful people often continue as they were. In this story, legal instruments become part of the network. Non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality clauses, settlements. Some victims reached civil settlements with Epstein. In many cases, the details were sealed. Sealing can protect privacy, but it can also hide patterns. And when patterns are hidden, each new victim can be made to feel alone. A sealed settlement can also become a kind of silence tax. The victim receives money, but the story is contained. The public does not learn what was alleged. Institutions do not learn what to watch for. People who might have spoken become unsure whether anyone else has ever spoken before. It is a private solution to a public problem. Then there is the network of institutions that, according to critics, failed. Police departments and prosecutors have discretion. Schools have obligations. Social services have mandates. The question is not whether any one institution could have done everything. The question is whether the accumulated hesitations became a kind of permission. In the mid-2000s, Palm Beach police began investigating Epstein after a complaint. Detectives reportedly interviewed multiple girls who described similar experiences. The investigative material, as later reported, suggested a pattern. And yet the result was not the kind of full-scale prosecution many expected. the 2008 plea deal, negotiated with federal prosecutors, including Alexander Acosta, has been widely criticized. Acosta later faced intense scrutiny, and in public statements, he defended aspects of the deal, while also acknowledging its controversy. Many observers, including victims and advocates, have argued that the deal represented a profound failure of justice. From the outside, a plea deal can look like a closed door. From the inside, it can look like a compromise, a pragmatic choice, a calculation of risk. But when the person accused is wealthy and connected, compromise can be experienced as abandonment by those harmed. The network around Epstein also extended into the world of philanthropy and academia. Donations to universities, funding for research, hosting events with scientists. Some institutions later returned funds or reviewed the relationship. These relationships complicate the story because they show how money can purchase not only services, but esteem. Esteem is protective. It is easier to doubt a teenager than a donor. It is easier to question a local detective than a man who knows senators. And it is easier to dismiss a story when the storyteller lacks a platform. In later years, journalists like Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald revived attention to the Palm Beach case, publishing detailed reporting that re-centered victim accounts and highlighted the plea deal's unusual protections. That reporting is often credited with contributing to renewed law enforcement focus. It also illustrates another part of the network, the role of persistent reporting when formal systems stall. The network includes the victims themselves, not as a structure of wrongdoing, but as a structure of survival. Many alleged victims describe being isolated from one another, unsure who else had been harmed. When victims do connect, whether through advocacy, journalism, or litigation, their accounts can reinforce one another and create a pattern that institutions cannot ignore as easily. When we say network, we should also include the people who resisted. There were investigators, journalists, advocates, and victims who kept speaking, even when they were ignored. Their persistence is part of why the record exists at all. Tonight, we do not reduce this story to a single villain and an undefined crowd of shadows. We will name what the record supports. We will mark what is alleged, and we will notice the connective tissue, the ways in which access and accountability can be altered by money. Because the network around the shore is not only about the island, it is about every shoreline where the powerful disembark and expect the world to adjust to them. And it is about the quiet mechanisms that make that adjustment feel normal. The phone call returned quickly when a donor calls. The complaint delayed when a teenager calls. The legal letter that arrives immediately. The victim's statement that waits. Every long story of alleged exploitation has an early moment when the system nearly breaks. In the Epstein timeline, those moments appear in the public record as complaints that did not lead to decisive action, as warnings that were shared privately, as rumors that circulated without consequences. By the time the Palm Beach police investigation began in 2005 and 2006, it appears that some people in the community had already heard stories. According to later reporting, girls were seen coming and going from Epstein's Palm Beach home. Some were reportedly dropped off by parents who believed their daughters were taking part in legitimate work. Others, according to accounts, kept the experiences secret out of fear or confusion. In investigations, the first crack is often not a dramatic confession. It is a small report that feels almost impossible to explain. A parent hears something. A teacher notices a change. A friend says a name too often. Someone, finally, calls the police. Once police become involved, the story enters a world of procedure. Interviews, statements, corroboration, warrants, meetings with prosecutors. Procedure is both necessary and fragile. It can protect accuracy. It can also become a hiding place for delay. Palm Beach police reportedly pursued the case with significant effort, interviewing alleged victims and gathering statements. The details of that investigation have been discussed in media accounts and in later litigation. What has been widely acknowledged is that local detectives believed they were dealing with serious allegations involving minors. They believed the case should be charged accordingly. But then, the matter moved into a broader prosecutorial framework, and the outcome narrowed. Epstein's 2008 plea agreement in Florida resulted in a sentence that included jail time, but under conditions that were later described as unusually favorable, including work release. The deal also contained provisions that critics argued shielded potential co-conspirators from federal prosecution. That non-prosecution agreement became a central point of controversy. For alleged victims, the experience of that deal was not abstract. It shaped what they believed was possible. If the system had looked at their accounts and produced this outcome, what would speaking again accomplish? That question is part of how silence is produced. There is also the matter of notification. Under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, victims have certain rights to be informed and to participate. Litigation later argued that those rights were violated in the handling of the plea agreement. In 2019, a federal judge found that prosecutors had violated the law by failing to properly notify victims while negotiating the deal, according to court rulings reported widely. The legal consequences of that finding were complex, but the moral significance was clear. The process was, in the eyes of the court, not transparent to those who should have been central. The notification issue matters because it reveals how power can work even inside a legal system designed for fairness. A plea agreement can be negotiated quietly. The accused has counsel. Prosecutors have discretion. Victims, unless explicitly included, can be left outside the room. And once the deal is done, it becomes hard to undo. After the 2008 conviction, Epstein was required to register as a sex offender. That fact often surprises people because the social narrative around him did not fully shift. He continued to move in elite circles. He continued to have relationships with public figures. Some of that was possible because of geography, because of selective disclosure, and because of the way people compartmentalize. They may have heard something but not wanted to know. Compartmentalization is one of the most common tools in institutional failure. It allows people to say, truthfully, that they did not know certain details, while ignoring enough context that they should have asked. In the Epstein story, many people have said they were unaware of the extent of allegations until later reporting. That may be true, but the record also shows that Epstein's conviction was public. It was available. And yet, in certain rooms, it did not end the invitations. This chapter is also where we should be careful about rumor. The Epstein case became a magnet for speculation. People search for hidden lists, for coded symbols, for definitive proof that implicates everyone they dislike. Some of that speculation has no grounding. It can distract from documented harm, and it can turn real victims into props in other people's narratives. Documentary work requires discipline, focus on what can be supported. What can be supported is that a series of warnings existed long before 2019. There were local police findings in the mid-2000s. There was a conviction in 2008. There were civil suits and settlements. There were public reports. And still, the story did not fully break into national consciousness until later. In 2015 and 2016, a civil case filed by a woman identified as Jane Doe included allegations against Epstein and, in some versions, against other high-profile individuals. That litigation eventually ended, and the claims became part of a broader public debate about what can be proven in court and what remains contested. The story is a reminder that filings are not findings, and allegations are not verdicts. But filings are also not nothing. They are, at minimum, an attempt to place a narrative into the official stream. There is also the role of local knowledge. In places like Palm Beach, people who worked near Epstein's home, or who lived nearby, sometimes described hearing rumors or noticing patterns. But local knowledge can be contained by social pressure. In wealthy communities, people can fear losing work, losing access, or being labeled as troublemakers. Silence can be an informal rule. The first cracks, then, were not just legal, they were cultural. The willingness of journalists to revisit old cases, the willingness of institutions to reconsider donors, the willingness of people to say, quietly, something is wrong here, and the willingness of victims to speak again, knowing what had happened the last time. A crucial crack came in 2018, when the Miami Herald published a multi-part investigation that centered the voices of alleged victims and described the 2008 plea deal in detail. That reporting is often cited as a turning point. It did not create the story. It amplified what had been there. In the months and years that followed, the story accelerated. Law enforcement attention renewed. Civil litigation expanded. The public began to look at flight logs, at photographs, at donations. Some of that attention was responsible, grounded in documents. Some was not. But the overall effect was that Epstein could no longer exist as a footnote. And once the cracks formed, the structure that had held for years began to shake. One reason it shook so hard is that the plea deal had created a sense of impunity. When a person receives a lenient outcome relative to alleged conduct, they can interpret it as a sign that consequences are negotiable. That interpretation, whether accurate or not, can shape behavior. Critics of the 2008 deal have argued that it did not only fail to punish, it failed to deter. We should also note that the cracks exposed not only the accused, but the system that surrounded him. Prosecutors, institutions, donors, universities, social circles. When the story became public again, many people who had once treated Epstein as eccentric began to distance themselves. Distance is easy after the fact. The record asks harder questions. Where was the distance when it mattered? The Epstein timeline is often described as having two legal chapters: the 2008 Florida deal and the 2019 federal case. Between them is a long corridor of partial consequences. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida state court to charges that included solicitation of prostitution and solicitation of prostitution of someone under the age of 18. He served time, but under work-release terms that were later scrutinized. Many people viewed the outcome as deeply inadequate, given the alleged conduct described in police reports. Others argued that plea deals reflect evidentiary realities and legal constraints. What is not disputed is that the deal was unusually lenient relative to the seriousness of allegations that had been publicly described. The aftermath of the plea deal had multiple layers. For victims, it meant that a legal process that might have validated their accounts ended in a way that felt like an erasure. For Epstein, it meant he carried a conviction but retained freedom, wealth, and social access. For the institutions involved, it left a controversy that would later become a major political issue. One reason the controversy persisted is that the deal was not simply about sentencing. According to widely reported accounts, it involved negotiations that included unusual protections, and it involved a process in which victims later said they were not adequately informed. That combination created the impression of a system working differently for the powerful. In the years after 2008, Epstein faced additional civil suits. Some were settled. Settlement can provide money and a measure of acknowledgement, but it can also prevent full public airing of evidence. In cases involving sexual abuse, victims may choose settlement for many understandable reasons: privacy, emotional safety, and the desire to avoid the trauma of trial. But from a public accountability perspective, settlements can leave the broader story fragmented. Those fragments matter because predators, according to many experts on abuse dynamics, thrive in fragmentation. If every victim is isolated, each story can be dismissed as an exception. If stories are connected, a pattern emerges. A pattern is harder to ignore. Then came 2019. In July 2019, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York arrested Epstein on charges related to sex trafficking. The indictment alleged that he had sexually exploited dozens of underage girls in New York and Florida, and that he had paid them to engage in sexual acts. The indictment described a pattern of recruitment and abuse, and it asserted that Epstein used employees to facilitate encounters. In court, Epstein pleaded not guilty. The arrest brought a surge of attention. Suddenly, the old questions returned with new intensity. How had he been allowed to continue? Who had helped him? Who had known? What evidence existed? The public saw images of law enforcement searching his properties. Reports described the discovery of photographs, compact discs, and other materials. Prosecutors argued for detention, describing Epstein as a flight risk with vast resources. The court denied bail. In public reporting, the bail hearings became a kind of procedural theatre. There were arguments about private security, about monitoring, about the ability of wealth to create a custom form of confinement. The judge's denial was notable not only for what it meant for Epstein, but for what it signaled: a willingness, at least in that moment, to treat his resources as a risk rather than a reassurance. In August 2019, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The official determination by the New York City medical examiner was that he died by suicide. That conclusion has been challenged by some, and alternative theories have circulated widely. But in documentary work, we should note the official findings and acknowledge that public distrust remains. Epstein's death ended the criminal case against him. It also ended the possibility of a full trial that could have established facts through adversarial process. In the weeks that followed, multiple official reviews and reports examined breakdowns inside the facility, including failures of staffing, monitoring, and procedure, as described in later government reporting. Those findings became part of a wider public argument about how high-profile detainees are managed, and about whether the system can reliably protect life in custody. For some people, the institutional details mattered more than any theory. A jail is supposed to be controlled space, and yet control failed. The death also created a sharp informational vacuum. The public had been bracing for a trial that might have compelled testimony, produced exhibits, and forced disputed narratives into the open. Instead, many of the most consequential questions remained in the realm of inference. What prosecutors had, what they hoped to prove, what witnesses might have said under oath, and which allegations could have been corroborated. The case, in effect, shifted from adversarial truth-finding to piecemeal disclosure through civil litigation and investigative reporting. For survivors and advocates, this is where the frustration becomes structural. The criminal case was the one forum with the most power to compel evidence. Once it ended, the remaining avenues were slower, narrower, and more dependent on private initiative. Civil suits, unsealing motions, negotiated settlements, and the choices of institutions to release or withhold information. That does not mean nothing happened afterward. It means the kind of collective reckoning people expected became harder to achieve. For many alleged victims, this was a second kind of loss. A trial might have produced testimony, cross-examination, and evidence. It might have created a public record that could not be sealed. Instead, the case ended in a quiet, locked room. The aftermath was not quiet for long. Epstein's estate became the focus of civil litigation and settlement processes. In 2020, the estate established a compensation fund for victims, and many people submitted claims. Such funds can provide faster compensation than litigation, but they also raise questions. What qualifies as proof? Who decides? And how does one translate trauma into a number? Still, for some, the fund represented a tangible acknowledgement that harm had occurred. A compensation fund is not a trial. It is not a verdict. It is, at best, a practical form of recognition. Money offered in exchange for a process that aims to be less adversarial. For some survivors, that can be a relief. For others, it can feel inadequate, because the deeper need is not financial. It is for truth, for accountability, for the record to say what happened. Meanwhile, prosecutors pursued others. In July 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested and later charged with offences related to recruiting and trafficking minors. The government alleged that Maxwell helped Epstein target underage girls, groom them, and facilitate abuse. Maxwell pleaded not guilty. In 2021, after trial, she was convicted. She was later sentenced to prison. The Maxwell case mattered because it placed parts of the alleged system into a courtroom with evidence and witnesses. But the story did not end there. Civil suits continued against various entities and individuals, including claims against financial institutions. Banks such as JP Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank faced lawsuits alleging that they enabled Epstein's trafficking by providing services and failing to act on warning signs. Some of those cases resulted in settlements. Settlements often include no admission of wrongdoing, and companies frequently emphasize that settlement is not an acknowledgement of liability. Still, the existence of these cases reflects the broader question: how do systems of finance intersect with exploitation? The banking cases also raise a wider issue: compliance as moral boundary. Banks are required to watch for suspicious activity, but the definition of suspicious can be shaped by the perceived legitimacy of a client. A wealthy client with elite references can be treated as low risk. And yet, in hindsight, The allegations suggest that wealth itself was part of the risk. There were also legal actions by the US Virgin Islands government, which filed suit against Epstein's estate and later pursued litigation connected to the management of the island properties and alleged facilitation. Some of these disputes ended in settlement. Again, settlements are not the same as findings, but they show institutional effort to recover accountability after the fact. In the public sphere, some high-profile figures faced intense scrutiny due to their association with Epstein. One prominent example was Prince Andrew of the United Kingdom, who faced civil allegations by Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most well-known accusers. Prince Andrew denied wrongdoing. The civil case in the United States ended in a settlement in 2022. As with many settlements, it did not include an admission of liability. Public consequences followed in other ways. This chapter is where the story becomes a map of modern accountability. Criminal cases, civil suits, settlements, corporate compliance, reputational fallout, political hearings. It is also where frustration grows, because the public wants a single moment of resolution, and the system offers only fragments. There are reasons for that fragmentation. Epstein's death removed the central defendant. Evidence that might have been tested in trial remained largely unseen. Victims' stories, while often consistent in pattern, varied in detail and were spread across jurisdictions. And the network, if it existed as alleged, was dispersed. Yet the record does show certain truths. It shows that a man with immense wealth was repeatedly accused of exploiting minors. It shows that law enforcement encountered credible complaints. It shows that a plea deal in 2008 limited exposure. It shows that a later federal case alleged a broad pattern. It shows that an associate was convicted. It shows that many victims sought compensation and recognition. And it shows how modern public accountability can be both powerful and incomplete. Documents can be unsealed, names can be debated, institutions can investigate themselves, but none of that restores what was taken. In the aftermath, the island became an object, a property to be searched, sold, photographed. But for survivors, the island is not real estate. It is memory. And memory, unlike property, cannot be auctioned into silence. At the end of a story like this, people ask for a list of names, a list of crimes, a list of answers. But the record is not a single clean ledger. It is a pile of documents, many partial, some sealed, some contested, some verified. There are depositions where a witness speaks and then pauses, because the memory is heavy. There are police reports that read like unfinished conversations. There are flight logs that record travel but not intent. There are photographs that show proximity but not consent. There are settlements that end cases without ending questions. What remains first are the voices of those who spoke. For years, many alleged victims described a similar progression: recruitment in adolescence, introduction into a wealthy environment, normalization of boundary violations, payments that felt like both reward and trap, and a sense that the adult world around them was not going to intervene. Some said they tried to tell someone and were dismissed. Some said they were too afraid to tell anyone. Some said they did not have the language for what was happening until later. In many public accounts from survivors of sexual exploitation, there is also the long aftermath, the difficulty of trusting, the difficulty of reporting, the way a single event can echo across years. When the public consumes a case like this as a true crime spectacle, It can forget that survivors live with the consequences long after headlines fade. What remains, second, is the lesson of institutions. The Epstein case is often cited as an example of how wealth and influence can distort justice. Critics point to the 2008 plea deal, to the failure to notify victims, and to the way Epstein continued to move through elite spaces after conviction. Defenders of particular decisions may argue about prosecutorial discretion and legal constraints, but the broader pattern is hard to ignore. Accountability moved slowly, and when it came unevenly. That unevenness is not only about law enforcement, it is also about how organizations respond to risk. Universities, charities, and cultural institutions have fundraising needs. Donors can be treated as essential. When a donor brings money, the pressure to ask hard questions can weaken. In the years after Epstein's arrest, many institutions publicly reviewed donations and relationships. Those reviews suggest that earlier scrutiny was not always strong enough. What remains, third, is the question of complicity. In popular culture, the Epstein story has been folded into a larger sense of distrust. Distrust of the rich, distrust of institutions, distrust of official explanations. That distrust can be understandable. It can also be dangerous when it fuels baseless claims. The responsible path is not to deny suspicion, but to anchor it in evidence. There are proven facts and there are alleged patterns. The proven facts include convictions and court findings. The alleged patterns include a wider web of knowledge and involvement that has not been fully proven in court. The public may never receive a definitive accounting of every person who knew, every person who participated, or every person who looked away. So what do we do with an incomplete record? We treat it as a warning and as a call to build systems that do not rely on luck. We ask why young people can be approached so easily with promises of money and opportunity. We ask how schools, families, and communities can recognize grooming and coercion earlier. We ask what legal reforms could prevent secretive deals that cut victims out. We ask how prisons and jails handle high-profile detainees, and why a death in custody could happen in a facility designed to prevent it. We also ask about the islands in our culture that are not made of land. An island can be a private jet. It can be a gated mansion. It can be a non-disclosure agreement. It can be a social circle where questions are treated as impolite. It can be a workplace where a young employee is told that discomfort is the price of ambition. In the Epstein case, many of the most haunting details are not exotic. They are procedural. A girl is asked to come back. A check is written. A schedule is kept. A phone call is not returned. A complaint is downplayed. A deal is made. If you want to understand how harm persists, look for the ordinary steps that allow it. This chapter is also where we acknowledge the aftermath for survivors. Some have become advocates. Some have pursued lawsuits. Some have asked for privacy. Some have struggled with the fact that the public consume their trauma as a spectacle. The documentary impulse can be both helpful and harmful. It can create awareness. It can also create a market for horror. There is also the question of what is still sealed and what may never be fully known. Some records are kept private to protect victims. Some are kept private because of legal agreements. Some may be destroyed or lost. And some exist in forms the public will never see. Memories. The things people almost said. The moment a friend hesitated before speaking. In recent years, parts of the record have surfaced in bursts, a tranche of documents unsealed after litigation. excerpts from depositions, new disclosures in civil cases, or summaries in official filings. Each release can feel like a promised key, and each release tends to disappoint people who want a single master document that settles everything. The truth is that records are rarely that neat. A deposition captures one person's memory under questioning. A flight log captures a route, not what happened after landing. A photo captures a moment, not context. And when documents are released after years of secrecy, they arrive into a culture that is ready to interpret them as confirmation of whatever it already believes. This is why responsible viewing matters. It is possible to care about accountability and still reject reckless accusation. It is possible to demand transparency and still protect survivors' privacy. It is possible to say, honestly, we do not know, and still take the known patterns seriously. The archive is not a weapon for partisan fantasy. It is a set of clues about how exploitation can hide in plain sight. Tonight, we try to choose the careful path. We say alleged when it is alleged. We cite court filings when they are court filings. We remember that a filing is a claim and a conviction is a finding. We hold space for the fact that many survivors are not interested in our certainty. They are interested in not being forgotten. What remains in the records, finally, is a sense that the story will never be fully closed. Even after convictions, even after settlements, even after properties are sold, even after names fade from headlines, the questions linger. How did he get away with it for so long? Who could have stopped it? What signs did we train ourselves to ignore? In the quiet after the noise, the archive does not answer back. It only sits there, waiting for someone to read. And that is the last image we leave you with tonight. A file on a desk, a coastline in the dark, a plane disappearing into cloud, a door that should have opened sooner. Because the story is not only about one island, it is about the distance between what is whispered and what is acted upon. And as we step back from these pages, we do it gently. We do it without spectacle. We do it with the awareness that, for some, this is not history. It is a living wound. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,